Hi everybody, welcome back to Mando Lessons. This lesson I'm just going to do a quick little talk about changing between chords. You've got a number of chords going in any given song, whether you're playing chop chords or just two finger chords or kind of any kind of chords and accompaniment you might be doing on a mandolin. There's a lot to be said for learning to smoothly transition between those chords. Some are going to be more natural transitions than others. But that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit in this lesson. If you're interested in other sorts of lessons like learning some fiddle tunes or learning some songs or other techniques on the mandolin, check out my website, mandolessons.com. It's a bunch of totally free lessons with tablature and play-along tracks for the tunes that I teach. There's all kinds of stuff over there. I recommend checking it out. It's totally free. If you're interested, there's a couple ways to donate, but all the information is just there, ready to be watched, free of charge. But donations do help me keep the site running, and I put out new lessons every week. So subscribe if you're interested in getting new lessons every week. Just subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you'll see them. So, getting back to chords. If we start with our first basic chords like G, C, and D, let's think about those for a little bit. If you're unfamiliar with those chords, there's lessons over at mandolessons.com that'll teach you those chords and this basic strumming pattern. There's a whole series on different strum patterns over at Mando Lessons you can watch. But if we're just kind of going through a basic strum on the most basic level, kind of one beat like that. We're on our G chord. There's two things to think about when you move chords. You got to keep your right hand going nice and steady, and you got to move your left hand, and you got to make sure your left hand moves at enough time so you let your G chord ring out as long as possible, but you also get a nice clean C chord when it comes to that. So if I move my chord too quickly, it sounds like this. Whereas if I move my chord just at the last second and still able to get a nice clean sound, it sounds like this. So that's a great exercise just to work on that kind of hand coordination of getting your left hand to move with just enough time to get a nice clean connection in your left hand while your right hand continues to do the nice strum pattern you've got. And that goes, with more complicated patterns like this. Again, there's lessons on these patterns over at mandolessons.com. If my left hand's out of sync, it'll sound like this. It's not quite as smooth. And that's with a fairly straight ahead chord change. When you go from G to C, that's another thing to think about, is realize that your left hand doesn't really need to reconfigure itself. It just needs to move a little bit. Your fingers kind of stay in that same shape, and you go from the two highest pitch strings to the two strings in the middle of the instrument. But then when you go to a D chord, you need to rearrange your fingers. And when you're going to a new chord shape that kind of requires you to move a lot, you need to think about kind of the most important notes. And it depends on the strum pattern. But if you're doing your basic down strum, or maybe let's do a bass strum pattern. You go to C, and then you go to D. Your most important note to get is that second fret on your G string, because you're about to play a bass note. And then it gives your, if you need to, it gives your middle finger a little bit of time to get down to that second fret on the E string. So we don't need to worry about the bass notes on our G and C chords because they're just open G. you go to that D chord, you really need to get right in there with that second fret on the G string with your pointer finger and be ready for that bass note. And I'll try to kind of over exaggerate how my middle finger can be a little slow. It'll look like this. See how my middle finger kind of just got there at the last second. Get my pointer finger over and gives my middle finger a little bit of time. That said, it's great to really practice kind of nailing all these chords nice and steady. So if you are just playing, if you're playing just straight downstrokes, you need all your fingers to be right there, right at the time, or you'll get this sort of sound. Which isn't a bad sound in this particular case. A little bit of hammer-on sort of thing if your middle finger is late. Not a bad sound, but if you're maybe in the key of B, it's not going to work in the same way. Or if you start you're in a key that uses less open strings. So that's a couple things to keep track of is, keep your right hand nice and steady. Figure out what your important notes if you're playing a bass. Keep track of what your bass notes are. Make sure you got your fingers where they need to be at that given time. And really, play nice and slow. If you're having trouble getting between any particular chords, like maybe you're going from a G chord to a B chord, and if you're looking for these chords, they're over at mandolessons.com in some chord lessons. So we're on a G chord. We're going to go to this B chord, which is 4-4. It's kind of a bar chord. 4th fret on the G, 4th on the D, 6th fret on the A, 7th fret on the E. And if that feels uncomfortable, it'll get more natural the more time you put in trying to play that chord. And that's a big jump. It's a far cry from going from G to C. You're totally rearranging your hand. You have to shift up the fretboard. So the way to, when I first tried to play that, it sounded like this. Okay, and then you gotta get your fingers in the right spot, and then maybe it ends up coming out. You don't get all the notes to ring out. A lot of things can go wrong. So really just playing nice and slow. Try to keep your right hand nice and steady. And just go back and forth from those two chords. Maybe set a metronome if that's your cup of tea. And just practice that one movement at a nice slow speed rather than kind of cruising right along on the progression that you know. And then having to slow down for that hard switch. Play the whole thing nice and slow. So when you get to the hard part, you can maintain that speed. Or whatever your progression may be. Slow everything down so that you can play the hardest part naturally and with good rhythm. And then slowly speed the whole piece up. And I guess one last thought maybe, if you're playing around with chop chords, and if you're confused about what chop chords are, or you don't know those shapes, again, mandolessons.com has some lessons on how to make chop chords and how to use them. But one thing that's really important to realize is your hand, if you're using this chop shape, it just kind of stays in that shape the whole time. G, C, D, G, G, C, D, and G. So really keeping your hand in that shape is going to allow you to move between those chords more effectively versus going G, reset, C, reset, G, reset, G. You know, just keep your hand in that. Like when I go from a G chord to a C chord, my pinky just kind of falls off the top of the fretboard. I still have it there. If I had a lower string, my pinky could be on it. And you know, just keeping that, rather than kind of reconfiguring your hand to the same shape every time you move, you can just kind of move it across the fingerboard and slide up and down. And that can come in handy for not only playing chords, but also playing solos. Something like that, you know, just if you're kind of playing chords, or if you're playing a solo out of a chord shape, you know, keep your fingers in that nice shape and kind of see how that can help you by, you know, not having to reset, or, you know, if your fingers are in a shape that sounds good, that's the beauty of the mandolin, is you can move it anywhere on the fretboard and you get a different key or a different chord. And that's one thing to keep in mind. And really, you know, be conscious of your left hand is what I'm trying to say. And realize when you're using shapes that look similar, and resist the urge to kind of lift all your fingers off and then bring them back down in their new chord. Keep your fingers low to the fretboard. It'll really smooth out your music. It'll make your chord changes a lot easier. And then with more complicated chord changes, just slow them down. Really get everything to ring out nicely. And take it slow. So I hope this helps. Again, tons more lessons over at mandolessons.com, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.